3, where he says, knowing this first, that scoffers will come in the last days. These scoffers, these are false teachers. That's just who he's talking about here. That scoffers will come in the last days, walking according to their own lusts, and saying, where is the promise of his coming? For since the fathers fell asleep, all things continue as they were from the beginning of creation. This is what they are willfully forgetting, that God is going to judge. These false teachers are questioning the judgment of sin and the seriousness of its judgment. And of course, we see that in the behavior in verses 3, where he says they're walking according to their own lusts. And if you go back to chapter 2, what were they doing? They were luring and pulling people away from the truth, tempting them and their own lusts and evil desires. But that's what they're doing. See, when you look at what the church is doing today, because we're in the times that Peter is talking about here. We're living in these days. We are living in the last days, where false teachers are being greatly multiplied everywhere we turn. Think about the extreme acceptance of the homosexual lifestyle by many church leaders today. Think about the general acceptance of sin by many church leaders and churches today. People in the church who are living in not even hidden, but being, loud about it, being open about the fact that they're living in rebellious sin, and the church not approaching that person and saying, we love you enough to remind you that God hates sin and you need to repent, that He will judge sin. Instead, using the words tolerance and acceptance and love, they're turning a blind eye to sin. This is who Peter's talking about. This is who these verses are addressing. And today, some have coined some terms, hyper grace or easy believism. And then the far end of the spectrum would be universalism. Now, Rob Bell, who started out well, he's an extremely good communicator. A very, very good communicator. And was raised up under a good pastor. He was actually taught very faithfully. But then when he was sent out, he started changing the message just slightly. And today, Rob Bell is a universalist. He doesn't believe in eternal hell, and he says love wins, and I say, yeah, love wins. Jesus went to the cross, and anyone who accepts Him will be saved. Love does win, but justice is not erased by love. See, God's attributes work this way. The word attribute, it just means who God is, the character of God. But we use the word attribute with God because these things always remain. They're always there. If it's an attribute of God, He is always this thing. He's always this. In everything He does, He's loving. That's one of His attributes. And everything God does, He's loving. But in everything God does, He's just. And in everything God does, He's righteous. And in everything God does, He's merciful. Humans could never walk in those things simultaneously in perfection. We aren't always any of those things. Do you agree with me? I'm usually either angry or not. But anger isn't one of His attributes, so that's a bad explanation. I'm usually either showing mercy or I'm not. Right? Like, there's no in between with me. I'm just one, But God is always loving. In everything he does, he's loving. But in everything he does, he's just. Rob wants to ignore the just. So do all these that fall into this camp. Hyper grace. Hyper grace is basically this idea that grace is a warm hug. Says, God accepts you just like you are and there's no need to change. That's not what grace teaches. That's not what the Bible teaches. Grace is the enabling power of God to pull you out of the mire and empower you to live a holy life. That's grace. That's what grace is. Grace is not a warm hug saying, God's okay with the mess you are and you don't have to change. He accepts you just like you are. Listen, he'll accept you just like you are and then radically change you by his grace. That's what grace is. And this is not being taught from many pulpits around the world. And easy believism is a little bit less than hyper grace. It's just the idea that, it's almost the parading of the fact that we may sin. And I use the word may because that's what the Bible says. I read it to you last week in Proverbs where it says, the righteous man may fall 7 times. But guess what? The following of that is, it doesn't say may, it says, but 7 times he gets back up. There's no may in the second part. See, but you may fall. Christian, don't believe the lie you don't have to walk in sin anymore. Don't believe that lie. You do not have to walk in sin anymore.